Welcome to the Retzel Health Law Hotspot. Health Law Hotspot is a podcast for physicians and health professionals that covers the legal issues and trends that affect the healthcare industry.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Health Law Hotspot. I'm Ericka Adler, shareholder and leader of the healthcare practice at Retzel and Andrus. Today, I'm joined by Janie Tremlett, who's going to talk to us about how physicians can explore the opportunity to introduce value-based care to their practices. Janie's an experienced business executive with CWH Advisors with a strong focus in handling strategy and revenue producing functions like provider revenue and health plan contract management, sales and marketing, client services and success, strategic consulting, and product marketing. And she brings to us today a topic that we haven't really ever discussed, but which is growing certainly in importance, which has to do with value-based care. Now, I know physicians are not sure that there's a role for them, particularly if they have a small practice in value-based care. And we're going to hear from Janie today about whether that's true or not. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Ericka. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, it's a burning question. And right now, if we look at the total revenue of provider organizations from small practices to large health systems, it's still a pretty small percentage, of the total revenue. Most people are still on a fee-for-service basis and operating that way. However, there's a strong push. Certainly CMS and Medicare and Medicaid have been pushing hard to move practices and health systems to a value-based mode. So in other words, looking more at outcomes rather than, a service approach. So what I would say in terms of who should participate now and how do you tell if you're too small or whatever might be on your mind, I would say if, you're really struggling with fee-for-service rates, in other words, especially if you're in a specialty where the rates have been very challenging compared to what you need to pay providers to deliver these services, then, these value-based contracts might offer things like bundled rates, which might be a better scenario for you. The other thing is, if you do have a large Medicaid and or Medicare population, again, CMS is leaning towards doing more and more value-based type of contracts. So, and again, if you have a population that you're managing, so patients in your practice that, have a lot of chronic illness, that would also be another opportunity for value-based care and contracting. And that's just, a few examples. There are many more, but just something to start with. And the great thing about where value-based contracting is right now, there's a huge spectrum in terms of how you get started and where you are. I think most people feel if I get into value-based care and contracting, I have to go, at full risk with my population. And, it has to be a very complicated scenario. And there are many sort of steps to get your feet wet along the way. I actually have a slide that we've shared that might be helpful in terms of just seeing a visual of, how you can start in the different elements. So if I could, let me share it now. So you can see on the left, fee for service, which again, most people are involved with right now, all the way to, what's called capitation and performance-based contracting, which is basically the most complicated and involved value-based care and contracting arrangements you can get involved with. And, so that you can certainly start slowly. There are many insurance companies and health plans that are offering what's called pay for performance. So in other words, if your patient population meets certain outcomes, you get a upside in the revenue that is attributed to you for meeting those outcome objectives. So that's a good way to get started. It's pretty straightforward, and often people are looking at, depending upon what your specialty is, what the appropriate objectives might be to accomplish that. But again, that might be a good way to start. And it's still very encounter based. As you move closer to capitation, you start getting into more from an episodic perspective. So again, if your practice, which is typically seen with chronic conditions and certain types of specialties where there's a whole bunch of services that you deliver to treat a patient for a particular condition or even episodically. And it makes sense that right now, from a fee-for-service basis, you're reporting that on an encounter basis. When you move to things like shared savings and bundled payments, you can now bundle things together, and there might be some advantages there where there are certain types of services which are not reimbursed today that might be reimbursed under this model. And typically these bundled rates are higher than fee-for-service, to recognize that there are, it's more holistic treatment of the patient with more services that are being offered than on a fee-for-service basis. So that's just an example of how you can start, what might be appropriate for your practice or organization, and the different types of value-based arrangements that exist.
So this is really interesting to me in terms of practical, operational type, decision making or steps. Does this work for the solo doctor, or do you have to have a certain number of people? And how would they go about finding these types of contracts? If you're just a doctor, you have a very busy practice, they hear this podcast, this sounds great. Where do they go? What do they do?
Right. I think since this is focused on populations, I think it depends upon how many patients a solo practitioner might have. But if the patient volume is big enough, plus, if the composition of the patient volume, for example, has a lot of chronic conditions that they're managing, then yes, they could be a candidate for value-based contracting. And basically how you get started, I would recommend that you talk to the health plans or insurance companies that you're currently contracted with, and ask them, do you have any value-based programs going on? Would I be a candidate for them? And just to try to dig a little bit deeper into what's going on for their current, insurance companies and payer mix.
Okay, so even a smaller physician or physician practice that has enough of a patient population could themselves call up the payors and kind of talk to them. Now, right. Are there particular specialties? I know you mentioned, chronic conditions, you mentioned Medicare, Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
Are there certain specialties where this really is just not going to work for them and or it works great for them, that, so if anybody's listening to this, they don't kind of waste time if it's not a good fit? Well, what would you say to that?
Yeah, no, totally. I think there are definitely specialties that many of the payers and insurance companies are focusing on, either because of, issues with access to care. So one example I can give you is behavioral health. Behavioral health has been a specialty that has had challenges with fee-for-service rates. And there is, as everybody knows, a big issue with access to care. There's a big shortage on the behavioral health side. So there are a lot of initiatives within health plan organizations to look at doing value-based contracting to try to make it more attractive for behavioral health providers. So that's an example of one that's definitely up and coming, and there's a fair amount of focus on that specialty.
Have you seen people go to value-based healthcare and it just didn't work for them? And can you then reverse it and pull out?
Yeah, it's so value-based contracting, while sounds great, people are always very enamored with, oh, this is going to be a higher revenue for me. It also comes with operational extra operational responsibility. So one thing we always recommend is to really understand what you're getting into, and also the different types of contracting also becomes more and more involved. So it's important to really understand what you're getting into before you jump in. If the payer is talking about a structure where the operational lift is going to be greater, obviously, than the revenue, the additional revenue, then that probably doesn't make sense. So it's really important to do the analysis of what's actually involved in implementing one of these contracts compared to the additional operational lift.
Is that something that a doctor can really reasonably do themselves, or is that somebody they have to talk to the consultant or their accountant? I mean, I'm just trying to, I don't want people walking out from listening to this and suddenly calling up the payors and then
Right.
thinking, that they were misled in any way. Is this something that the average doctor will really understand what the lift is or what the work is that's involved?
Yeah, I do think it's something that requires, some expertise. It's definitely a different world. And even people who are, great at billing, that, practices have relied upon before, the value-based stuff is new to them. So, it's sort of the issue of you don't know what you don't know kind of thing. And, it's important to get, reach out and get some expertise, because it is a new area. I'm sure once time goes on and this matures more and it's more prevalent, then there'll probably be, plenty of opportunity for people to learn about it and attempt it, themselves. But we are still in the nascent stage of it. So.
Right. For those practices that definitely have like their dedicated consultants or dedicated operational billing type people, this may be worth them investigating for sure. Are there other disadvantages other than kind of the amount of work that might be involved? Have you ever seen someone do it? I guess maybe they didn't see the extra money they thought they were going to see, but is there any other downside to doing it that you can think of?
Yeah, there's definitely cash flow impacts, for people that are used to fee for service, and they might be, forecasting revenue, on a more regular basis. If you go to, for example, the bundled payments, those are usually on a monthly basis. So you just have to consider, those issues. And then again, how you structure these contracts. So, you can have a favorable financial impact. Sometimes providers get involved with these things a little bit too quickly, and then there's some negative financial implications. So you want to make sure you're optimizing your revenue to the fullest and you have everything set up to be able to do that.
Well, that's a good point. So if somebody's listening to this and they're like, wow, I really do want to get into value-based care, it sounds like there's some preparation that's involved. You said, making sure they understand their revenue stream. I assume knowing who their contracts are with, which ones are most valuable to them, making sure they have the right people helping them so that they can make sure they have a team assembled and they're not thinking they understand something that they don't really understand and make a big mistake that affects their cash flow unexpectedly, et cetera. Right. So, okay,
exactly.
Great. New slide. So tell us all
about that was a great prompt. What we recommend is looking at some key areas and really doing an assessment on understanding where you're at, and then identifying those gaps so that you can be prepared for assuming this new responsibility. So from a contractual perspective, exactly, where are most of your patients, where are most of their insurance coming from? Usually there's a concentration, maybe not, but take a look at that. And then, because that will obviously influence those contracts. And then how are they set up today? Are they purely fee for service? Are there any requirements? What kind of population do you have? Are you, 20% Medicaid, 50% Medicaid, 50% Medicare? How are your, what is the mix of those type of contracts? So really understanding that is critical. From an organizational perspective, the value-based stuff typically goes across organizations, so that where people typically in practices have very, specific roles and responsibilities, value-based contracting sort of goes across. So how would you manage, that whole care and, model that goes across? Do you have the right people in place to do that? Operationally, how do you look at if, for example, that I used in the beginning, where you might have an outcome that you're trying to achieve for your patient population, do you have the clinical model in place that can produce those type of outcomes? Do you have to do any tweaking or fine tuning to achieve that? And then from a billing perspective, does your, either your outsource, billing provider and or your billing system, can they handle things like bundled payment, for example? So for each of these, I won't go through every single area, but there are really key questions that need to be, looked at and evaluated for each of these key areas, so that you're not caught off guard as you enter into these value-based contracts.
So for the physicians that you work with, have you seen them be able to increase and I'm guessing the answer is yes, because you're a proponent of value-based care, but have you been able to see significant increases in revenue as a result of this switch to value-based care? Is it just, a small amount? Is it a significant amount? Is it worthwhile now, or is this something that people should wait a little bit longer until they try and get involved? Like, what does it look like?
Yeah, no, great questions. And, as always, it depends. If you're just doing the pay for performance that I had mentioned earlier, on all the way close to fee for service here, where you're looking at, trying to achieve, 3 outcomes with your patient population, and there's some, upside, there's a little risk there. And so that, again, that might be a place to start and get your feet wet. And that's, something to consider. Again, as you move closer and closer to, the capitation model, there's more risk involved. And, I would recommend more pause to take before jumping into these things. So, we always hate the "it depends" thing, but I think it's important to evaluate, where you are, what, also, one thing we've done with several of our clients we've worked with is really look at what they're getting right now for revenue and how their clinical model is structured, to see what the difference might be. Because for some practices and for some services, it might not make sense to jump in and have, this extra operational responsibility and reporting and so forth, where the fee for service is working right now. But in other cases, as I mentioned in the beginning, you might have, some very low rates, and you're really struggling, in terms of compensating providers appropriately and being able to, make ends meet. So, that is an area that we've seen, a lot more progress and, more revenue optimization for those, practices where you have those situations. So there are many factors involved in this, and that's sort of why we, really encourage people before jumping in to figure out, all the different elements that might be appropriate for them.
Right. I think that's great advice. And I think for many practices, they just have been thinking that they're not big enough for this to even be something to consider. And I think listening to you, that is definitely not, a presumption to be made. I mean, you really need to take the time, maybe get a little bit of expert advice on this to make that evaluation, because if you are a good candidate, this could be, an excellent opportunity to increase revenue. And who doesn't want to do that right now when doctors are are really facing a lot of shrinking reimbursement. So for everybody listening, I hope that you'll consider, everything that Janie has shared with us today. I mean, this is a lot to think about. And definitely reach out with any questions to see if you're a good candidate. I know Janie, and she's with CWH Advisors, are happy to help. This is kind of a very specialized area. So, people, that's not something your lawyer will help you with. And it's definitely not something that your, normal accountant is going to have the expertise in. So really do need to talk to somebody who knows this area, but it could be a worthwhile investment of time, and money to have somebody review your practice. So I really appreciate you sharing this information. We're always trying to help our doctors out there find ways to improve their practice, and especially for independent practices to be able to stay independent, which is really what a lot of this, is about. So any final thoughts on this topic? Is there anything we didn't tell people listening that you really want them to know about bringing value-based care to their practice?
I think, it is a big change, from the current environment, but I think everybody would agree that moving away from volume-based reimbursement, in the long run, is really a better way to go to treat people. But it's very important for practices to survive and make sure that they're adequately compensated for. So that's where it all has to come together. Stating a little bit the obvious, but important.
Well, I think that's great advice. And I hope, we'll share your information. And if anybody has questions, please, reach out to Janie directly. These are, and I can imagine a lot of my clients, will be really interested in this because everybody's struggling right now. That new physician fee schedule comes out every year and everybody's like, and then we're talking about how do we handle compensation for our providers going forward. We see costs going up and reimbursement going down. So there's some opportunities to investigate new areas of potential increased revenue, and you have nothing to lose by finding out a little bit more about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Again, everyone, this is
Thanks.
Janie Tremlett from CWH Advisors, and this has been the Health Law Hotspot. We hope to see you next time, and you can check out some of our other podcasts at ralaw.com. Thanks.
The Retzel Health Law Hotspot is made available by the firm and its attorneys for educational purposes and to provide general information, not to provide specific legal advice. Use of the Retzel Health Law Hotspot does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and the firm or any of its attorneys. The Retzel Health Law Hotspot should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice, and you should contact an attorney in your state about any legal needs or questions you may have.